Today we're going to be making these cute napkin rings and talking about interfacing. As usual, you can show up here to my channel and watch for whatever reason you want. If you just want the napkin ring tutorial, that's totally fine. But be aware that I have organized my channel as a step-by-step sewing course with each component building upon the last. So if we're talking about something in this video, I assume that you have watched all my content from beginning to end. So if you're lost, go back to the beginning and work your way to this point. Today's project, I'm going to call more of a bonus project in that you really don't have to complete this one to get out of this video what I want you to get out of this video. I actually wasn't going to talk about this one in the sewing course, except that I was on an online forum for table decorators and they all really liked this napkin ring and wanted to know how to do it, and I thought it was a really great opportunity for me to talk to you about interfacing. So if that's all you really wanted to know, yeah, that's what's in these guys that makes them stand up is interfacing. Otherwise, they would just be floppy and ribbony and not stand up. But what you want to put inside of something like this is an interfacing. So anytime you have something that's sturdy or has structure at all, it's because there's interfacing in it. There's all kinds of interfacing, and we're going to talk about several of the different types and what they're used for and ways that you can kind of, experiment around. And that is to prepare you for the next project we're going to do, which will have interfacing in it. It is a drawstring bag with a gusseted bottom. On my table setting group, people really didn't want to know how to sew these. I mean, you don't exactly need a tutorial to show you how to make a little seam in the middle and line it and then do a couple seams around the outside edge. That's not difficult. It's pretty basic, pretty straightforward. But what everyone wanted to know is how I made them stand up and have structure and form to them. And the answer to that is always interfacing. If you want to give something structure, bulk, or shape, the answer is interfacing. Now, there's a ton of different interfacings, and that's also what they wanted to know. I'm going to show you 5 today that actually work for this project. So that's why it wasn't just a straightforward answer. It really depends on what you want to achieve and how puffy you want it or how stiff you want it or what the fabric content is of the ribbon. So that's the part that I really felt like deserved a tutorial, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Let's get on with these cute napkin ring holders so we can talk about interfacing. For this video, we need to head back to the fabric store. So here I am in the fabric store, and I'm headed over to the interfacings. They're gonna look like that. See that rack of white? That's interfacing. As you can see, there are tons of different types of interfacing, just, a ton. So how are you gonna be able to tell what these are for and which ones to use for which project? Well, let's talk about it. When you see this tall tower of interfacings, do not be alarmed. They have color coordinated each of the interfacings according to their uses. These are the color-coded categories of interfacing usage. Pink would be apparel, blue, embroidery, orange, fusible web and adhesive, yellow, crafts and home decor, and green for quilting. So if you're using the interfacing for an apparel use, it's pink. If you're using it for an embroidery use, it will be a blue bolt. If you're using it for a fusible web or adhesive use, it's going to be orange. If you're using it for a craft or home decor use, it will be a yellow bolt. And if you're wanting to use it for a quilting usage, you'll find it on a green bolt. Let's talk about interfacing that you would use for apparel. That would be things like collars or waistbands, or sometimes to reinforce a facing. All interfacings come in 2 varieties. There's either a sew-in type, where you will actually have to sew the interfacing onto the face piece, or there's fusible, which has little glue dots on it and you apply it with an iron. For example, this is a sew-in featherweight. So you know that you will have to sew this one in, and because it says it's featherweight, you don't want to use this on a project like canvas, which is a really heavyweight fabric, but it would be perfect for a lightweight cotton or a satin or some other lightweight type of fabric. Let's take a look at this one up close. You can see it's rather stiff, and then I can show you how it would be applied to our ribbon project. You can see that you would need to sew that interfacing down on all edges of this project. I don't really recommend using sew-in interfacing for this project simply because there's not a lot of room in the seam allowance to hide those stitches that you have to do when you sew in an interfacing. Whenever you're using a sew-in interfacing, you need to make sure that the stitching line that you make by sewing the interfacing in can be hidden in the seam allowance, because you don't want that line of stitching to show. Now we've got a sew-in lightweight woven interfacing, which you would use to put inside of a woven project like a knit. Now, if you look at it, it looks a lot like muslin. I felt like this was sort of a cotton type of fabric, and honestly, if you didn't have anything else, you really can use muslin as a really great interfacing. It will give bulk and structure as well. Buckram is mainly for drapery headers. If you're going to make draperies someday or be in home dec sorts of things, then you'll know about buckram. Otherwise, yeah, this is buckram. And here's a new one that I've never seen before and never used. It's called Shape Flex, and I would assume that you would put this into something like a knit that had a lot of movement that you needed to be able to stretch. It was really cool. I will hope I get to use it someday. Now let's talk about fusible interfacing for apparel projects. This first one is a fusible featherweight, and I use it all the time. Now this is one that you'll apply with an iron, and I'll show you that process a little bit later, but I use fusible featherweight on all kinds of things, waistbands, collars. I actually have an entire bolt of it at home because I use it so much. I'll be using this fusible featherweight in our project today on the gray velvet ribbon, so you can see exactly how it works, and I think it gives a really nice result. But for now, take a look at these little raised dots. Every fusible is going to have little raised dots like that, or a shiny surface. That's the glue, and you have to have glue, otherwise it can't fuse. So really, it's just those glue dots being applied with heat that makes it stick. This is just like the fusible featherweight, but it's a fusible midweight. So this will be for fabrics like canvas or denim or, bottom weights, anything that's a little heavier. This next one is an easy knit fusible interfacing, and I've actually never used it before, but it's really great. It reminds me of tricot, a very stretchy tricot. And, it fuses as well as stretches. So you could use it for any stretchy project like lycra or knit or even tricot, anything that's going to have stretch, but that you want to give a little bit of stability and structure to. If you're working with a dark colored fabric that you don't want that white interfacing to show through, then they do have these darker version, black or gray versions of all of these same interfacings. So do remember, if you're using a dark colored fabric, to check out the dark colored interfacings. And finally, we're to the crafts. My zone of influence in your sewing world. So decor bond I use constantly. I have bolts and bolts of this stuff. Anytime you're going to sew a purse, a handle, anything craft related, this is the stuff you want to be using. If you're sewing a placemat, decor bond is the interfacing you want. But if you want something really firm, I think you could make a kid playpen out of this stuff, or a toy box, or, stand-up baskets out of this stuff. You want the ultra firm. Now there are two types. They're either the type that fuses on both sides, or there's the type that fuses on one side. You need to be really careful about which one you get. I wasn't, and so for this project, unfortunately, I had a little bit of trouble because I got the dual side rather than just the single side. This flex foam fusible interfacing was new to me, but I did use it for this project and it was really interesting. It makes your project really puffy, sort of like quilted, except it's a little stiffer, so not quite like quilt batting. But yeah, if you're looking for a puffy but still kind of structured look, flexible foam will do that for you. Or if you want to sew it in, there's this straight up foam. And apparently you can use this as interfacing. Usually when you get to foam, to me, that's more of an upholstery project. But if it's very thin, I guess you could line a few things with flexible foam. And now one of my favorite interfacings ever, Insul fleece. I don't know why they have this categorized as a quilting fabric, except that there's a little bit of loft. But Insul fleece, you can actually insulate something. So if you're making a lunch bag, you can actually make it insulated by putting Insul fleece in there. Or an oven mitt or a hot pad, you can insulate them using Insul fleece. It's magical, fantastical stuff. Fusible fleece is another one of my all-time favorite interfacings. I use it constantly and we're going to use it today. The great thing about fusible fleece is not only does it give it structure, but also softness. So if you're doing a bag, or if you're doing maybe even a sewing machine cover, or something that you want to have that quilted look, but you also want it to have structure and to stand up, fusible fleece is your friend. Also, I totally recommend it for smaller quilted type projects, just because you don't want to be fighting with that batting that so often likes to move around and shift. No, fusible fleece will stick so that you don't have all that moving around and difficulty navigating your fabric. So yeah, fusible fleece is wonderful. And now the wonders of Wonder Under. And it really is kind of wonderful. It makes any fabric stick to any other fabric. So you really can make your own iron-on out of this stuff. Like you can put a fabric on the top, put some Wonder Under on the one side of that, and then iron it on to another piece of fabric. Or you can take two pieces of fabric and use it almost like stitch witchery. So Wonder Under really is just fabric glue in a way, and you can use it that way for a lot of different applications, usually craft oriented. Another product I have yet to try that I can't wait to try is this vinyl fuse. This product can turn any fabric into a waterproof fabric. So if you're making a makeup bag or a lunch bag or a tablecloth, anything that you want to be able to wipe down and have that waterproof finish, then you can use this vinyl fuse to make that happen. And I like that a lot because usually you're using oilcloth and you can't always find a design of oilcloth that you really like. And so using this vinyl fuse, you can literally take any design of fabric that you prefer and turn it into a waterproof type of fabric that you can use for all those other applications. I love it. Actually, in the time that it's taken me to create this video, these videos take me forever, I was able to use the vinyl fuse for another project, and this is a lunch bag. I was able to make a waterproof lining using my regular fabric so that it would match the project, and I think it turned out spectacular. I went back and bought the entire bolt of vinyl fuse. I'm going to be using this a lot. I love coming to the fabric store. I feel like every time I'm here, there's something new. Like this guy. He could be, a new friend. You could buy yourself a friend. He's looking a little thin though. I mean, maybe he needs some interfacing, more bulk. Not sure I could get that guy home, but look at this cute little skeleton bird. I could add interfacing to this. I'm going to show you several different options of ribbon today. a velvet, a grosgrain, a stripe grosgrain, and a satin. Each napkin ring requires 2 cuts of ribbon, the front piece and the lining piece at 6.5 inches long, as well as a 6-inch piece of interfacing. And that is because you don't want the interfacing to creep into the seam line and bulk up the seam. For our project today, I've used fusible fleece, fusible featherweight, fusible foam, decor bond, and fusible ultra firm interfacings. Again, I will recommend not using sew-in interfacing for this project simply because it's impossible to hide the seam line. You'll just end up sewing over that seam line and making a big mess. You'll want to put your interfacing glue side down, see there's the little dots, onto the front piece of your napkin ring. There's our glue, and you're going to put it face down onto the front piece of the napkin ring on each one. Unfortunately, I bought double-sided interfacing, which you really don't need and actually is not appropriate for this project, but I had to kind of scramble. So if you see I've got paper on the top of that, that is because there's glue on both sides and I don't want to put glue on my iron. And so the way to get around that is to take the paper that comes with the interfacing and then iron onto the paper. So this first one is just a fusible fleece and it is not double-sided, so therefore I can iron it in place without, ruining my iron. But when you see me putting the paper down, that's why, because I did not want to ruin my iron with glue. It's not the most pleasant, but you just peel the ribbon carefully off of the paper and it works out just fine. This is the fusible foam. Take a look at how puffy that is. That'll make a very puffy napkin ring. This is my velvet ribbon and I'm using the fusible featherweight to go on that one. Now the fusible featherweight is not really that bulky, and so I made it just as long as the ribbon. That one won't really matter that much because, as I said, it's not going to bulk up the seam too terribly badly. So that is why that one is just as long as my ribbon. And last but not least is the ultra firm interfacing. This one definitely needs to be shorter than your ribbon because it is extremely bulky. I think when I did this, I didn't realize that until after I'd started sewing it. And so it doesn't show it right here, but I did cut it down to make sure that that interfacing was not in the seam line when I sewed it. There's the grosgrain ribbon with the decor bond. And then the stripe ribbon with the ultra firm interfacing. The velvet ribbon with the featherweight fusible. Satin ribbon with the foam, fusible foam. And satin ribbon with the fusible fleece. You'll notice I've cut away the interfacing from the seam line. That's very important, especially for this ultra firm interfacing, because it is very bulky, and if you sew the interfacing into the seam, it will not lay down properly. With the ribbon right sides together, we're going to sew just a very small 1/4 inch seam along that ribbon edge. Just one little seam. Here we go. Right sides together and just a 1/4 inch seam. Now the lining piece and right sides together, another 1/4 inch seam. Notice, like a good sewist, I have pressed out my seams. Take the lining piece and turn it right side out. We're going to put that lining piece right over the top of the front piece, like so. Here comes the tricky part. Let's top stitch around the top and bottom edges of the napkin ring. That's a lot easier said than done. There's actually a couple of different ways to do this. This is the first way, and you just have to go very slowly and carefully, working with that little napkin ring all the way around. Okay, to do it the other way, you'll just put the napkin ring, the foot inside of the napkin ring. I actually find this to be a little easier, but again, it's such a small area that you'll find that you just have to go slowly and work with that little tiny napkin ring all the way around. To do this really requires quite a lot of skill, so I wouldn't be surprised at all if you beginners have a lot of trouble with this. Don't be too upset. I will show you in the future that I actually had some trouble, especially with that satin ribbon. That was just kind of a nightmare. I would not recommend satin ribbon. But yeah, this is a very kind of difficult, tricky little project because it's so small. So go easy on yourself. Don't worry if it's not perfect right away. Just keep practicing. This is a really good project for learning how to handle your machine in tight places. So even if you feel like you're not happy with the result, you can be happy you're learning a new skill. And this is the only way to do it, by practicing. Let's do another. This is the velvet ribbon with the featherweight fusible. I did not cut away the excess because featherweight is quite thin and will not bulk up the seam. Right sides together on the lining piece and sew another 1/4 inch seam. Once you've pressed both of your seams open, you can turn the lining piece to the front and then place it over the top of your front piece. Notice I matched the seam line of the lining to the seam line of the front piece. Top stitch around the top and bottom edge of the napkin ring. Napkin ring number 3 is a satin with fusible foam. Fusible foam is quite bulky, so I cut it out of the seam line. Put those right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam. Satin is by far the most difficult ribbon to use for this project, and I will admit I struggled just a little bit with it. The seam line shows more than the other ribbons, and it tends to slide a lot as you're sewing, so it's more difficult to sew a straight seam line, and it tends to kind of buckle. It will pull differently. You have to make sure that you have the right needle, and even then it still buckled and puckered on me. I wasn't too happy with satin. Here's satin with the fusible fleece, which actually was a little easier than the foam. Now, whether it's because it slid or because it pulled a little bit more on one side or the other, or because it was slightly larger on the lining than it was on the front piece, I don't know, but it did pucker, and there's the evidence. Oops. Last but not least is the grosgrain with the decor bond, which is not that thick, so you don't need to cut it out of the seam line. One last time, let's review. Make sure your right sides are together and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then turn the lining towards the front and put it over the top of the front piece, matching your seams, and then you're going to top stitch on the top and bottom edge of the napkin ring. Or here's a close-up view. Now that I've made 5 different napkin rings out of 3 different types of ribbon, the grosgrain and satin and velvet, along with 5 different types of interfacing, I am going to recommend this ultra firm stabilizer that I used in this one as probably the most professional look, the best looking one for this particular project. It just has a lot more stability. It looks more like a real napkin ring. And I also find that the fusible featherweight or the fusible decor bond works just fine if you have a beefier ribbon like this velvet. I would not recommend sewing on satin unless you have a better machine than I'm sewing on. Use better colored thread than I did. I should have matched it more carefully. Or, you know, have just extreme, wonderful sewing skills. Satin is a little tricky. I don't feel like I got the best result out of that one. Let's check out how cute these look on an actual place setting, shall we? The magic of these napkin rings is their versatility. You can change the look by changing the pin on the outside. This is a flower pin I made, and this is a vintage brooch that belonged to my grandmother. A brooch I found at the hobby store, another brooch, yet another brooch that I found, and a flower pin that I made, another pin I made out of a sand dollar, and a pin out of a satin ribbon rose that I made, as well as this final pin that I made out of a flower. Now that you know everything you need to know about the magic of interfacing and how it makes all of your projects stand up and look incredible, you can join me next video when we're going to make this fun drawstring bag with a gusseted bottom, which you will need your interfacing for. And it comes in different colors. Well, that is, if you go to the fabric store and buy a different color. That part is up to you. I don't choose your fabric for you, but yes, you can do this drawstring bag project in a number of different colors, and you can add little pins and cute things to it, which I can't really help you with. I'm not in charge of what you guys are picking out at the fabric store. Although I did provide you almost an hour-long video all about the fabric store. So if you need help with your fabric choices, go watch that video.